Hey guys! Tonight, we're heading back to Rome. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Maybe make sure your blanket is within reach. Because this story is about one of the most reluctant emperors Rome ever had. A man who somehow went from being a horse-loving, onion-breath provincial kid to the grumpy founder of the Flavian dynasty. Yeah, we're talking about Vespasian. The man who built the Colosseum, taxed people for using public toilets, and then apparently told a joke as he was dying. Very on brand. Now, Vespasian isn't the most glamorous Roman emperor. He wasn't an Augustus with golden laurel crowns. He wasn't a Caligula with his wild horse obsession. He wasn't even a Nero playing the harp while things sort of burned. Vespasian was more like that practical uncle who fixes your sink, complains about the cost of bread, and then suddenly inherits a billion-dollar company because everyone else at the top conveniently died. So tonight, let's float back to the 1st century. Rome is chaotic. The Julio-Claudians are gone. 4 emperors are fighting over the throne like kids fighting over a toy sword. And somehow, Vespasian, a man who had been written off as too boring to ever be emperor, is the last one standing. But before we get to that bit, let's start, gently, or with his early life. Vespasian was born in the year 9 CE. That's not exactly a glamorous year in Roman history. Augustus was still alive, looking increasingly waxy and paranoid. And Rome itself was in that awkward teenage phase where it was pretending to be a republic, while very much being a monarchy. Vespasian's hometown was Philachrone, a little village in the Sabine Hills, northeast of Rome. If you've never heard of it, yeah, that's kind of the point. It was the Roman equivalent of being born in a rural gas station town. The Sabines had a reputation for being sturdy country folk, think more farming and mud, less marble palaces and philosophy debates. His father, Flavius Sabinus, wasn't exactly elite. He was a tax collector. Which meant that, yes, Vespasian grew up in a household where the family income literally came from pestering people for money. His mother, Vespasia Polar, was a bit more respectable. She came from a line of Roman knights. Not the glamorous shining armor kind. More like the Iroquois, which was basically the upper middle class of Rome. Wealthy enough to matter. Not fancy enough to be senators. So little Vespasian's childhood was a mix of modest comfort and small-town dullness. He wasn't expected to do anything grand. In fact, according to later sources, his mom was a little embarrassed that he was kind of slow to get started in life. He didn't rush into politics or the military like other ambitious Roman sons. Instead, he took his sweet time, which, in Rome, was basically a crime. Now, Vespasian had an older brother, also named Sabinus. And Sabinus was the golden child. He was tall, charming, and moved up the political ladder fast. He became consul, held prestigious offices, and generally gave off Big Mom's favourite energy. Meanwhile, Vespasian was still hanging around the countryside. His mother supposedly nagged him about being lazy, saying things like, either be a man, or just be a mat. Which is basically the Roman way of saying, grow up already. Eventually, though, Vespasian did what Roman sons were supposed to do. He put on the toga of adulthood. And he started a political career. Not with fireworks. Not with charisma. But with this sort of steady, plodding effort that would come to define his whole life. So, let's float over to his early career. Vespasian began as a military tribune in Thrace. Which, in case you're wondering, was not the glamorous assignment. Thrace was a rugged Balkan region with mountains and endless cold. Basically, it was the Roman Empire's idea of sending someone to the middle of nowhere. And Vespasian spent about 3 years there. Probably doing boring administrative tasks, drilling soldiers, and trying not to freeze. Then he returned to Rome and did the next step, quaestor. That was the entry-level job in Roman politics, where you handle finances and paperwork. Again, not exactly headline material. Vespasian did this in Crete and Cyrene, which is modern-day Libya. So he probably spent a lot of time sweating in the sun, counting tax money, and yelling at locals about missing records. It's around this time that he married Flavia Domitilla. And here's where things get very UN royal. She wasn't noble. She wasn't famous. She was actually the daughter of a treasury clerk and had previously been married to a tax collector. Yes. The future emperor of Rome married into the tax collector community. This family was just neck-deep in money counting. Domitilla and Vespasian had 3 kids together, Titus, Domitian, and Domitilla the younger. Titus, of course, would eventually become emperor himself. Domitian would also become emperor, though less beloved. And Domitilla the younger, well, she died young, as so many Roman children did. Domitilla herself didn't live long either. She passed away before Vespasian became emperor, which means Rome never had an Empress Domitilla. Instead, when he rose to power, Vespasian relied on a freedwoman named Caenis as his partner. Caenis had once been a secretary to the emperor's mother, Antonia, and apparently she was smart, capable, and not shy about speaking her mind. Suetonius, our favorite Roman gossip, says Vespasian loved her deeply, though he couldn't officially marry her. But we'll get back to Caenis later. For now, young Vespasian was slowly climbing the ladder. One of the big turning points in his career came under Emperor Claudius. You remember Claudius? The stuttering, drooling, underestimated uncle who somehow stumbled his way onto the throne after Caligula got stabbed a few dozen times. Claudius was awkward, but he loved efficiency. And Vespasian, boring and practical as he was, fit right in. In the year 43 CE, Claudius launched his invasion of Britain. And Vespasian was there. He commanded part of the Second Legion, and apparently, he actually did quite well. He fought 30 battles, subdued 2 tribes, and captured the Isle of Wight. Which, yes, is still called that today. Basically, Vespasian was the guy who made southern England a Roman province. This was his moment of glory. Finally, he wasn't just the boring younger brother. He was a decorated general with real victories. Claudius rewarded him with triumphal honors. Not a full triumph, which was reserved for emperors. But the next best thing. He got the little crown of laurel leaves, and probably a nice parade. And yet, after that, things kind of slowed again. When Nero became emperor, Vespasian's fortunes took a dip. Nero, of course, was obsessed with music, theatre, and his own reflection. He liked beautiful people who could flatter him. Vespasian was none of those things. He was gruff, wrinkled, and didn't care about art. Apparently, Nero once got offended because Vespasian either fell asleep or walked out during one of his interminable performances. Which is possibly the most relatable thing Vespasian ever did. As a result, Nero basically benched him for a while. Vespasian held a governorship in Africa, but it wasn't glamorous. It was hot, difficult, and full of rebellions. There's even a story that he was so broke during this period that he rented out his mule team to make ends meet. Imagine a future emperor running a side hustle with donkeys. That's Vespasian. But fate had other plans. By the late 60s CE, the empire was falling apart. Nero had lost control. The Senate turned on him. And in 68, Nero dramatically committed suicide by stabbing himself in the throat, with some help from his secretary. Rome, suddenly, had no emperor. and this set off the infamous year of the 4 emperors. But let's not rush ahead. We'll ease into this. First came Galba, an old senator who was so cheap that people hated him instantly. He lasted only a few months before being hacked down in the Forum. Then Otho stepped up, promising to be better. He wasn't. He killed himself after losing one battle. Then Vitellius claimed the throne. Vitellius was not inspiring. He was known mainly for eating too much and having a soft spot for banquets. Which, honestly, same. While these emperors were tearing each other apart, Vespasian was off in Judea. Because, oh right, there was a massive Jewish revolt going on. Nero had sent Vespasian to crush it, and he was in the middle of that campaign when the throne in Rome became a game of musical chairs. And here's where destiny finally tapped him on the shoulder. Vespasian, the boring tax collector's son, suddenly had an army, a loyal base, and a very chaotic empire in need of stability. But before we watch him take the purple, let's pause here. Because this moment, this transition from a grumpy general in Judea to the emperor of Rome, is really where the sleepy drama of Vespasian's life begins. So, when we last left Vespasian, he was off in Judea, putting down a massive revolt. And meanwhile, back in Rome, emperors were dying like mayflies in August. First came Galba, the elderly miser who thought cutting soldiers' pay was a good idea. He lasted about 7 months before his own guards literally chopped him down in the Forum. Then came Otho. Otho was glamorous. Otho wore wigs. Otho thought he'd finally made it big. But after losing a single battle to his rival Vitellius, he fell on his sword in this weirdly noble, theatrical way. The kind of gesture Nero would have applauded, if he were still around. And then, we got Vitellius. Now, Vitellius was famous for one thing: eating. Ancient sources describe him as having 3 or 4 banquets a day, stuffed with rare dishes and delicacies. His stomach basically ran his career. And while he was feasting in Rome, armies were getting restless out in the provinces. Which brings us back to Vespasian. In 69 CE, while Vitellius was stuffing himself with oysters, Vespasian had command of the legions in Judea. And his friend Mucianus, governor of Syria, started whispering, hey, maybe you should take a shot at this whole emperor thing." Vespasian hesitated, which is very on brand. He wasn't young. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't even in Rome. But he had something better: soldiers who actually liked him. And not just any soldiers. He had the Judean legions. Plus, thanks to Mucianus, he had Syrian legions too. And here's the kicker: Egypt also backed him. And in case you've forgotten, Egypt was Rome's breadbasket. Whoever controlled Egypt basically controlled the food supply. It's hard to win loyalty from Rome if you can't ship them grain. So suddenly, this provincial general with donkerental side hustles had armies, money, and food on his side. It was time. But let's slow down a little. Because nothing in this year was straightforward. While Vespasian supporters in the east were declaring him emperor, Vitellius was still very much alive, waddling around Rome in his banquet robes. So the two sides marched toward each other. Vespasian didn't personally rush into battle. Remember, he was still tied up in Judea. Instead, he let Mucianus and other generals handle the fighting. Smart move. Why risk your life when you've got ambitious lieutenants willing to do it for you? Meanwhile, in Rome, Vitellius was trying his best to keep things together. And by his best, I mean he was handing out bribes, eating lavishly, and making excuses. Not exactly leadership material. By late 69, the two forces clashed. And, surprise, Vitellius's men weren't up to it. They were defeated at the Battle of Bedriacum. Vitellius fled back to Rome, tried to abdicate, then changed his mind, then tried again. It was a mess. In the end, Vitellius was dragged from his hiding place, killed, and his body was tossed into the Tiber. A very Roman ending. And just like that, the throne was open. And this time, it stuck. Vespasian was declared emperor. Now, this is the part where you'd expect triumphant celebrations, shining parades, golden crowns. But in true Vespasian style, the whole thing was almost awkward. For one, he wasn't even in Rome when it happened. He was still in the east, wrapping up the Judean campaign. So he basically became emperor long distance. The Senate had to declare him emperor without him physically present, which feels like becoming from king while you're still at home sick with the flu. It wasn't until the summer of 70 CE that he finally arrived in Rome. And when he did, the empire was in ruins. Civil war had shredded the treasury. Cities were in chaos. Morale was low. Nero's insane spending had emptied the coffers years earlier, and the year of the 4 emperors had only made things worse. This was not the glamorous beginning of a dynasty. It was the equivalent of inheriting a mansion, where the roof leaks, the basement floods, and someone has definitely stolen all the silverware. But Vespasian was, if nothing else, practical. He wasn't here for drama. He wasn't here for poetry. He was here to fix things. So, let's float into the Flavian dynasty. The first order of business, money. Rome was broke. And Vespasian was not shy about squeezing revenue wherever he could find it. He taxed everything. Luxury goods. Public services. Even urine. Yes, he introduced a tax on the collection of urine from public latrines. Because urine, believe it or not, was used in tanning leather and laundering clothes. The collectors made money selling it, so Vespasian figured, why not take a cut? When his son Titus complained that taxing pee was undignified, Vespasian supposedly held up a coin and said, "A money doesn't stink." That phrase has survived 2,000 years. Honestly, it's his greatest legacy. This penny pinching wasn't popular with elites, but it was effective. Slowly, Rome's finances stabilized. The empire could pay its soldiers again. Grain shipments were secured. And Vespasian himself became a symbol of thrift. No marble palaces. No golden statues. Just a plain, workman-like emperor. The second order of business, legitimacy. Vespasian wasn't a Julio Claudian. He had no divine blood. No connection to Augustus, or Tiberius, or even Nero. He was a tax collector's son. Which, in the snobby world of Roman aristocrats, was basically like being the manager of a convenience store and suddenly becoming president. So he leaned hard on propaganda. Temples started claiming omens had foretold his rise. He was painted as the man chosen by the gods to restore order after chaos. There were even miracle stories, like the time he supposedly healed a blind man with his spit. Yes, you heard that right. He also built things. Big, public things. Most famously, the Flavian Amphitheater, what we now call the Colosseum. It wasn't finished in his lifetime. But he started it. And the symbolism was clear. Nero had built a massive golden palace for himself. Vespasian, in contrast, built a stadium for the people. Bread and circuses, as the saying goes. This wasn't just about fun and games. It was a calculated way of saying, I am not Nero. I am not selfish. I am here for Rome. Now, you might be wondering, what about the Jewish revolt? Well, Vespasian didn't finish it. He left that honor to his son Titus, who went on to besiege Jerusalem in 70 CE. The result was brutal: the destruction of the Second Temple, massive loss of life, and a triumphal procession back in Rome with spoils of war carried through the streets. For Vespasian, this was political gold. His dynasty now had military victories to boast about. The temple treasures even helped fund the Colosseum. It was the perfect way to cement his family's claim to power. But let's not paint Vespasian as some flawless savior. He had plenty of critics. Roman elites found him coarse. He was known to crack jokes that were a little too earthy. He didn't care much for fancy etiquette. And he absolutely played favorites with his friends. Still, compared to the chaos of Nero and Vitellius, he was a breath of fresh air. Stable. Reliable. Even if he smelled faintly of onions, as some writers joked. And here's where we get to the softer side of Vespasian's reign. He actually seems to have been close to his family, at least by Roman imperial standards. His son Titus was clearly the favorite, the golden heir, polished and charismatic. Domitian, the younger son, was more awkward, moody, and insecure. Vespasian gave Titus top billing and Domitian, or the scraps. Which, spoiler alert, would not end well in the next generation. He also stayed devoted to Caenis, his partner, even though Roman society didn't recognize her as empress. They lived together openly, and she apparently had real influence at court. For a man who'd spent his early career renting out mules, this was probably the closest he came to romance. By the time he reached his 60s, Vespasian was still holding things together. Taxes were flowing. Soldiers were paid. The Colosseum was rising from the ground. And then, around 79 CE, he fell ill. Probably dysentery. Not a glamorous way to go. But in typical Vespasian fashion, he handled it with dry humor. Suetonius tells us that as he was dying, he joked, "Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god." It was a dig at the whole imperial cult, where emperors were deified after death. Vespasian, practical to the last, couldn't resist poking fun at it. Then he stood up, because he insisted an emperor should die on his feet, and promptly collapsed. He was about 69 years old. Nice round number. So, what do we make of Vespasian? He wasn't glamorous. He wasn't poetic. He wasn't even particularly likable to the aristocracy. But he was stable. He restored Rome's finances. He left behind a functioning dynasty. He built the Colosseum, which still stands. And he proved that sometimes, the boring option is the best option. Vespasian was the emperor Rome didn't ask for. But he was the one it needed. So, we've said our soft farewell to Vespasian. The donkey-renting tax collector's son who somehow ended up emperor. Practical, thrifty, onion-breath Vespasian. And now, we slide into the story of his two sons. Titus, the golden boy. Domitian, the overlooked younger brother. The Flavian dynasty was supposed to be stable. Solid. A family that Rome could actually rely on for more than 5 minutes. But, as always, Roman family dynamics had other ideas. Let's start with Titus. Titus was born in 39 CE, just a few years after Caligula had declared himself a living god and tried to make his horse a priest. Not exactly the most stable political climate. But Titus himself grew up in fairly ordinary surroundings. His father was still a mid-level official. His mother, Domitilla the Elder, was alive then. And little Titus was basically raised in the shadow of Rome's endless chaos. He got a good education. Standard Roman elite package, Greek literature, rhetoric, philosophy, and, of course, military training. He was clever, well-spoken, and, crucially, handsome. Ancient writers go on about his looks, strong features, nice hair, and natural charisma. Basically, he was the Roman poster child. Titus also had the advantage of growing up alongside Britannicus, the son of Emperor Claudius. They were school friends, which, at the time, looked like an excellent career move. Everyone assumed Britannicus would become emperor one day. So Titus was hanging out with the future of Rome. Great networking. Except, of course, Britannicus was poisoned by Nero at a dinner party before he ever got near the throne. Networking opportunities cut short. That's the Roman Empire for you. As Titus grew older, he followed the classic career ladder. Military service. Public office. The works. But his big break came with the Jewish War. Remember how Vespasian was sent to Judea to crush the revolt? Titus went with him, serving as his right-hand man. And when Vespasian left to chase the imperial throne, he left Titus in charge of the siege of Jerusalem. Now, let's be clear. This was not a gentle siege. Jerusalem resisted fiercely. Titus surrounded the city, cut off supplies, and waited. Starvation set in. Desperate fighting broke out. The temple itself, the Sacred Heart of Judaism, was eventually destroyed in 70 CE. The Romans celebrated it as a massive victory. They paraded the temple treasures through Rome. They minted coins proclaiming a Judea captor. For Titus, it was the crowning military achievement of his career. For everyone on the other side, it was devastation. The destruction of the temple is still remembered as one of the great tragedies of Jewish history. But from the Roman perspective, Titus was now a hero. When Vespasian became emperor, Titus was clearly marked as heir. And he fit the role perfectly. Charismatic. Brave. Skilled in battle. But he also had a reputation for enjoying himself. Suetonius, our favorite ancient gossip, drops hints about Titus having a little too much fun with women, wine, and theatre. He was charming, but maybe too charming. There were whispers that he might turn out to be another Nero. And then, of course, there was Berenice. Berenice was a Jewish princess, daughter of King Herod Agrippa I. She was beautiful, wealthy, and politically connected. And during the Jewish War, she and Titus became very close. Very, very close. By the time Titus returned to Rome, Berenice was basically living with him in the imperial palace. Which was awkward. Because Romans weren't thrilled about their future emperor shacking up with an Eastern queen. It reminded them way too much of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And we all know how that turned out. The Senate muttered. The people muttered. So eventually, under pressure, Titus had to send Berenice away. Which, frankly, feels a little sad. He clearly cared about her. But Roman politics had no patience for that kind of love story. When Vespasian died in 79 CE, Titus succeeded without much trouble. And the worries about him turning into Nero? They didn't really pan out. In fact, Titus turned out to be almost annoyingly good. He reigned for just over 2 years, and in that short time he earned the nickname a delight of mankind. Which, let's be honest, is not the most Roman of nicknames. Usually it's more like the cruel, or the mad, or the guy who poisoned everyone. Titus being universally liked feels suspicious. But he did have a rough start. Just a few months after becoming emperor, Mount Vesuvius erupted. The cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum were buried in ash and pumice. Tens of thousands died. It was one of the worst natural disasters of the ancient world. Titus responded by donating money, personally overseeing relief efforts, and generally behaving like an actual human being with empathy. Which, again, felt strange by Roman imperial standards. Then, in 80 CE, a massive fire broke out in Rome. It destroyed large swathes of the city. Once again, Titus opened the imperial purse, offered aid, and tried to rebuild. And, as if that weren't enough, a plague followed. Because apparently the gods wanted to stack disasters during Titus's reign. Through it all, Titus stayed calm, generous, and, by all accounts, kind. He finished the Colosseum, opened it with lavish games, and made sure the people had bread and entertainment. He even had the decency not to execute his rivals or purge the Senate. Which, frankly, is rare for a Roman emperor. It was almost too good to be true. And in 81 CE, it ended. Titus died suddenly at the age of 41. The official story was natural causes, maybe a fever. The unofficial rumor was that his younger brother, Domitian, might have had a hand in it. Because Domitian had been waiting in the wings for years. And brothers in Rome didn't always get along peacefully. So let's float over to Domitian. Domitian was born in 51 CE, the younger son of Vespasian and Domitilla. Which meant he grew up entirely in the shadow of his older brother. Titus was handsome, charming, victorious. Domitian was not. He was shorter, more awkward, more bookish. And as Titus rose to glory with his siege of Jerusalem and his charm at court, Domitian was left behind, stewing in resentment. Executions and treason trials became more common. Senators started disappearing. Friends turned on each other. Whisper networks flourished. And then there was his personal life. Domitian married Domitia Longina, a senator's daughter. But he also carried on affairs. At one point, he supposedly fell in love with his niece, Julia. That ended badly. Ancient writers, always eager for scandal, accused him of forcing her into a relationship and then causing her death through a botched abortion. Whether that's true or just character assassination is unclear. But either way, it added to his dark reputation. Despite all this, Domitian wasn't entirely incompetent. He managed the empire fairly well for a while. Taxes flowed. The army stayed loyal. Buildings went up. He even completed some of the Flavian monuments his father had started. But he couldn't resist his paranoia. By the late 80s CE, he was convinced everyone was plotting against him. And honestly, by then, they probably were. In 96 CE, it all came crashing down. Court officials, senators, and even members of his household conspired. He was stabbed to death in his own palace. The Senate immediately declared a damnatio memoriae, erasing his name from monuments, smashing his statues, pretending he'd never existed. Which, let's be real, is the Senate's version of unfriending someone on social media. But more dramatic. So, what do we make of the Flavian brothers? Titus, the golden boy, loved in life, mourned in death. Short reign, but bright and kind. Domitian, the overshadowed younger brother, bitter and insecure, who turned into a paranoid autocrat. Together, they show the two sides of inheriting power. For one, it brought out his best qualities. For the other, it fed every grudge he ever carried. And yet, both of them, along with their father, left behind monuments that still stand. The Colosseum. The Arch of Titus. Structures that outlived all their flaws and insecurities. The Flavian dynasty only lasted 3 emperors. Barely 30 years. But in that short time, they left a mark that Rome, and the rest of the world, still sees today. So, we've walked through the lives of Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. 3 very different emperors. One grumpy and practical. One charming but short-lived. One paranoid and suspicious. Together, they made up the Flavian dynasty. Now let's zoom out a little. Because while they weren't on the throne long, less than 3 decades, they managed to leave a legacy that shaped Rome for centuries. First and most obvious, the buildings. If you go to Rome today, and you do the tourist circuit, odds are the first thing you'll see is the Colosseum. That giant, elliptical amphitheater with holes in the walls, standing like a massive fossil in the middle of the city. That's Vespasian's baby. He started it almost immediately after becoming emperor, using money from the spoils of the Jewish war. Which is an elegant way of saying, those giant stones were paid for with loot taken from Jerusalem, and built by Jewish prisoners of war. Not the cheeriest origin story. But Rome was Rome. The Colosseum was a clever piece of propaganda. Nero had built his ridiculous golden house, complete with a massive artificial lake, for his own enjoyment. Vespasian drained the lake and built the Colosseum for the people. He gave the land back. He built entertainment on top of Nero's excess. It was like a big architectural middle finger to his predecessor. Titus, as we mentioned, opened the Colosseum with 100 days of games. Gladiators fought, animals were slaughtered, naval battles were reenacted. It was the ancient world's version of binge-watching a new series, except with more blood and less popcorn. Domitian later added the Hypergeum, the underground tunnels where animals and gladiators were held before being released into the arena. Because what's better than watching a lion appear from a trapdoor? For the Roman crowd, that was peak excitement. So even if you don't know the Flavians by name, you know their work. The Colosseum is still there. Still iconic. Still drawing crowds. But it wasn't just the Colosseum. Titus got his own arch, the Arch of Titus, which still stands at the entrance to the Roman Forum. On it, you can see carvings of the triumphal procession after the Jewish war. Soldiers carry the menorah and other temple treasures through the streets. It's a blunt, stone reminder of Roman victory and Judean defeat. Domitian, for all his paranoia, was also a big builder. He finished projects started by his father and brother. He rebuilt parts of Rome after the fire. He even built his own flashy palace on the Palatine Hill, which was so big and grand that later emperors just kept living in it. In fact, the word a palace comes from a palatine. That was Domitian's contribution. So, in terms of architecture, the Flavians were winners. Now, let's float into propaganda. The Julio-Claudians, the dynasty before the Flavians, had wrapped themselves in the mythology of Augustus. Divine ancestry. Golden lineage. All that good stuff. The Flavians? Not so much. They were new money. A family of tax collectors and small-town Sabines. No link to Augustus. No claim to Venus or Apollo as ancestors. Just practical, provincial roots. So they leaned into other tactics. Vespasian played the chosen by fate card. Omens. Miracles. Healing the blind with spit, as we mentioned earlier. He also presented himself as the anti-Nero. No golden palaces. No endless poetry readings. Just thrift, duty, and common sense. It worked. The people didn't want glamour anymore. They wanted stability. Titus leaned into his personal charisma. The delight of mankind. The generous emperor who cared about disasters, handed out aid, and finished his father's projects. His whole image was built on kindness. Which is rare for Rome, but clearly effective. Domitian, on the other hand, leaned into divine authority. Lord and guard. Statues. Formal rituals. He wanted obedience through awe. And while that may have worked with soldiers, it didn't win him friends in the Senate. So, each Flavian carved out a different niche. Together, they managed to convince Rome that their rule was legitimate, even if their family tree was, frankly, unimpressive. Speaking of family, let's drift into the personal quirks. Vespasian, as we've seen, was thrifty to the point of stinginess. He supposedly loved crude jokes. He made fun of his own appearance. And he had no problem taxing the most ridiculous things, because, hey, revenue is revenue. Titus was charming, but not without flaws. He had that whole Berenice situation, which scandalized Rome. He also had a taste for luxury and fun, though he managed to rein it in as emperor. His greatest strength was that he actually seemed to like people. Which, honestly, was unusual in a job where most of your subjects wanted to stab you. Domitian, in contrast, was the classic little brother who never got over being second best. He craved respect. He demanded titles. He punished critics. And yet, he was also meticulous, organized, and hardworking. He may have been paranoid, but he wasn't lazy. He just alienated everyone until they killed him. It's like the Flavian dynasty was a family sitcom gone wrong. Dad's the practical handyman. Older brother is the charming golden boy. Younger brother is the sulky kid who insists he's a god. And Rome had to live with them as emperors. So what happened after Domitian's assassination? The Senate moved quickly. They declared a damnatio memoriae, basically erasing Domitian's name from inscriptions, smashing his statues, pretending he'd never existed. Which, of course, only made him more memorable. It's like telling people not to think of a pink elephant. Now that's all you're thinking about. The Senate then chose a new emperor, Nerva. He was old, childless, and seen as safe. And thus began the so-called of 5 good emperors. You know, that golden run of relatively stable rulers, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius. So in a way, the Flavians were a bridge. They pulled Rome out of the chaos of Nero and the civil wars, stabilized it with some Donca-scented pragmatism, and handed it off to a new dynasty that could polish things up. But let's not undersell them. The Flavians left more than buildings and political transitions. They left a vibe. Rome learned that emperors didn't need to be glamorous or aristocratic. They didn't need to come from Augustus's bloodline. They could be provincial, middle class, and still rule effectively. Vespasian opened that door. And after him, plenty of emperors came from nowhere. Soldiers. Provincials. Outsiders. The idea of a divine dynasty faded. The idea of a capable ruler, whoever he was, became more important. That shift shaped the empire for centuries. And maybe that's why Vespasian is such a strangely comforting figure. He wasn't dazzling. He wasn't terrifying. He was just solid. A man who taxed urine, cracked jokes, and built the Colosseum. A man who, when he was dying, shrugged and said, I think I'm becoming a god, with a smirk. His sons carried on that mix of humanity and insecurity. Titus tried to be kind. Domitian tried to be feared. Neither lasted long, but together they extended the Flavian experiment just enough to leave a mark. So next time you see the Colosseum on a postcard, or walk through the Arch of Titus, or read about the Senate's endless vendettas, remember the Flavians. The family that wasn't supposed to rule, but did. The dynasty born from a tax collector's son and sustained by equal parts thrift, charisma, and paranoia. They didn't last long. But in Rome, longevity wasn't everything. Impact mattered. And the Flavians, in their weird, awkward way, definitely had that. And that's where we'll let our story drift to its close tonight. Vespasian, Titus, Domitian. 3 emperors. 30 years. One dynasty that managed to leave monuments that still stand, even if their family name doesn't get as much attention as the Julios or the Augusti. Because history isn't just about the glamorous dynasties. Sometimes it's about the donkor-renting taxman who became emperor, and the children he left behind. So, settle deeper under your blanket. Let the Colosseum stand tall in your mind. And remember, money doesn't stink. Good night.